It was the bitter winter of 1943, over the snow-choked fields of central Germany, and the skies above were alive with fire. The roar of engines cut through the frigid air, mixing with the distant staccato of anti-aircraft flak and the sharp whistle of enemy fighters slicing past in deadly pursuit. A formation of WWII flying fortresses, battered and wounded, clawed its way toward home, each plane a fragile metal bird holding within it the lives of 10 brave men. Inside the cockpit, sweat froze on brows beneath frost-lined flight helmets, and every shuddering vibration of the fuselage sent jolts of fear and determination through their bodies. Bomb bays hung empty, engines coughed smoke, and every instrument was a reminder that one wrong move could send them plummeting to the ground. The crew members knew the odds were against them. Reports of wounded comrades falling from the sky flashed like warnings in their minds. Yet amid the chaos, there was a flicker of calculated courage. A maneuver whispered among bomber pilots, but attempted only by those willing to risk everything. Eyes met across cockpits, silent communication heavier than words, trust in the plane, trust in each other, and trust in a desperate, daring tactic that could be the difference between life and death. Outside, the landscape was a frozen tableau of fields and forests, yet inside, the cabin was a crucible of human emotion, terror, focus, hope, and sheer will battling the relentless pull of gravity and the wrath of war. In that moment, suspended between life and oblivion, the doomed bomber crews executed a maneuver so audacious it bordered on the impossible, their fate balanced on a razor's edge, a delicate dance of physics and courage. The morning had broken with a grey, heavy sky, the kind of sky that presses down on men and machines alike, as if the heavens themselves were testing the courage of those who dared to rise into it. In the makeshift airfield of England, frost clung to every surface, the metal of the Bu-17s, the canvas of the maintenance tents, the worn leather flight jackets of the ground crews. The smell of kerosene and oil mingled with the sharp, biting cold, and every footstep on the frozen tarmac produced a brittle, echoing crack. Men moved with purpose and precision, their breath visible in ragged clouds, hands working tools and instruments with practiced care, knowing that every bolt tightened and every gauge checked could mean the difference between life and death once the bombers were airborne. The air was tense but electric, alive with the anticipation of another mission into enemy territory. Another chance to prove that courage and skill could triumph over overwhelming odds. Inside the cockpits of the flying fortresses, the atmosphere was a storm of its own. The pilots gripped their controls with white-knuckled intensity, their eyes scanning a complex array of instruments, dials and switches. Every vibration of the plane beneath them seemed magnified in the thin, cold air, every cough of an engine and rattle of a loose panel carrying the weight of imminent danger. The radio crackled intermittently, static and fragments of orders mingling with the distant drone of engines preparing to taxi. Crew members checked each other's harnesses and straps, double-checked oxygen masks, and exchanged terse nods, their faces a mixture of grim determination and unspoken fear. The bombardier, sitting at the nose, ran his fingers over the targeting equipment, feeling its cold metal under his fingertips, imagining the enemy cities below and the flak guns that would soon pepper the sky. As the formation began to move down the icy runway, the sound was deafening, a symphony of mechanical fury and human resolve. Engines roared, propellers slicing the air with a relentless rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. The smell of burning fuel and heated metal filled the cabin, clinging to the crew's clothes and hair. The vibration of the plane, as it gathered speed, was like the pulse of a giant creature awakening, and with every foot of runway conquered, the men felt both the exhilaration and terror of defying gravity in a fragile, iron shell. Outside, the airfield receded rapidly, replaced by a tapestry of patchwork fields, frozen rivers, and the skeletal remnants of war-torn villages. Once airborne, the B-17s climbed into the cold stratosphere, engines straining against the weight of fuel, ordnance, and human lives. The wind howled outside, rattling the fuselage, but inside there was an almost surreal calm. Every man was locked into his role, eyes darting, ears straining, hands poised to act in milliseconds. The gunner in the tail, his fingers numb from the cold, scanned the horizon for enemy fighters, his breath fogging the plexiglass window. In the waist, crewmen adjusted the flak jackets and ammunition, the scent of gun oil and sweat a constant reminder of the imminent threat. The pilot, his jaw tight, made micro-adjustments to maintain formation, knowing that one slip, one misjudgment, could mean the plane would be torn apart before it reached its target, or began the long journey home. The first crack of flak came like a distant drum beat, soft at first, then growing louder, closer, a staccato rhythm of destruction that jolted every man in the fuselage. The bomber shook violently, panels vibrating and the metal frame groaning as if alive, the sound echoing in the skulls of the men inside. Smoke curled faintly from a damaged engine, acrid and choking, and the smell of burning oil and scorched metal filled the cabin. Each crew member reacted instinctively, hands tightening on controls, fingers fumbling over switches, eyes scanning for damage, for threats, for the next move that might keep them alive. Fear was omnipresent, but so was focus. Every breath, every movement, every calculation mattered. The flight engineer shouted over the roar of engines, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold her steady! We can make it!" And for a fleeting moment, the entire plane seemed to shudder in collective defiance against the storm around it. Then came the first enemy fighters, dark silhouettes against a cloud-smeared sky, slicing through the pale sunlight with lethal precision. The gunners opened fire, the staccato of machine guns echoing off the fuselage, the smell of cordite and hot metal thick in the air. Tracers asked toward the intruders, leaving bright, deadly streaks against the grey expanse, and every man felt the split-second terror of being hit, of watching a comrade fall through the sky. The pilot dove and climbed, rolled and banked, each maneuver a delicate balance between evasion and exposing the plane to even more danger. The bombardier clutched his panel, knuckles white, watching both the target below and the fighters above, understanding that the mission required precision even in the midst of chaos. Amid all this, the risky maneuver, the very tactic whispered about in briefing rooms and pilots' bars, was prepared for, calculated, and finally attempted. It was a daring sequence of coordinated banking, throttling, and timing that pushed the B-17 to its limits. A maneuver designed to confuse both enemy gunners and pursuing fighters, giving the doomed crews a sliver of chance to survive where statistics said they should fail. Every man inside became a part of a living machine, responding instinctively, their fear channeled into precision. The cold, the smoke, the sound of tearing metal, and the constant threat of death fused into a singular, gripping intensity. As the maneuver began, the bomber tilted and shuddered violently, engines roaring and flak exploding around them, the earth and sky spinning in dizzying proximity. Inside, men clung to their positions, eyes wide, muscles taut, hearts pounding in unison with the throbbing engines. Time seemed both to stretch and compress. The world reduced to a series of immediate dangers, each requiring instant response, each potentially fatal. The tail gunner fired bursts at a fighter diving from above. The bombardier adjusted his scope. The pilot banked sharply to avoid incoming flak, and the flight engineer called out warnings of mechanical strain. And through it all, the crew knew that their survival depended entirely on flawless execution, trust in each other, and the sheer audacity of the maneuver itself. The sky seemed endless, a vast, icy expanse stretching in every direction, and yet in that open, frigid arena, death lurked at every angle. The Bu-17s, once majestic symbols of American air power, now appeared as fragile, battered metal shells, their wings torn and dented, engines struggling against both gravity and enemy fire. The roar of combat was relentless. It filled the air with a deafening, omnipresent force that pressed into every corner of the aircraft, vibrating the metal and rattling the nerves of the crew. The smell of burnt oil mingled with the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the metallic tang of fear lingered heavily in every breath. Inside, the crew fought to maintain not only control of the plane, but control of themselves. Calmly, methodically, even as their senses screamed the truth. Survival was slipping through their fingers. The formation wavered as enemy fighters struck with precision, cutting into the perimeter of the group with sudden bursts of speed and deadly intent. The gunners, faces pale from concentration and cold, ripped into the attackers with tracer rounds that lit the sky like streaking embers, the thunderous cracks of machine guns echoing through the fuselage. Each burst of fire carried the weight of desperation. Each movement could mean life or death. Smoke curled from minor engine damage, drifting into the cabin, stinging eyes and lungs, mixing with the scent of sweat and fear. The flight engineer moved like a shadow through the cabin, checking fuel lines, monitoring gauges, and shouting terse commands, his voice almost drowned by the roar of the engines and the sporadic hail of flak outside. Below, the European landscape blurred past in frozen patterns of white fields and dark forests, villages punctuated by skeletal remnants of bombed-out buildings. The bomber crews could almost feel the land below watching them, a silent witness to the mortal struggle above. Every vibration of the wings and fuselage was magnified, every jolt and shudder a warning that the thin metal frame might not withstand the strain much longer. The crew's minds were stretched taut, split between survival duty and the knowledge that one miscalculation could send their lives spiraling downward. In the waist, the men passed ammunition in precise, rehearsed motions, each shell loaded into the guns with a grim efficiency that belied the fear burning behind their eyes. Then came a new, escalating threat. A concentrated formation of enemy fighters, faster and more agile than the B-17s, maneuvering with a predator's patience, cutting off escape routes and attempting to isolate the weaker, slower bombers. Explosions of flak erupted around them, hot metal shredding the sky, each detonation sending shockwaves through the fuselage. The crew was thrown against seats and bulkheads as the plane bucked violently. The sound of tearing metal loud and terrifying. Oxygen masks clung to faces frosted with condensation, and the bitter air stung exposed skin. Yet even in the chaos, instinct and training prevailed. The pilot executed sharp banking maneuvers, the engines screaming in protest, trying to throw off attackers while maintaining the fragile lift that kept the bomber aloft. Every man inside became part of a singular rhythm, a synchronized effort born of experience, fear, and sheer willpower. The bombardier at the nose peered through frost, lined glass at the distant, smoking ground below, calculating not only targets, but possible landing zones in case the worst happened. The tail gunner pivoted and fired relentlessly, tracers illuminating the grey expanse as attackers dove from above, smoke trailing behind them like sinister ribbons. Inside the cabin, the flight engineer shouted warnings of overheating engines, fuel pressure drops, and potential structural failure. Yet no one faltered. The audacious maneuver, begun moments before, demanded absolute coordination and focus, and each man knew their survival depended on every precise movement being executed flawlessly. Time became elastic. Moments stretched and compressed simultaneously, every decision split, second yet weighted with immeasurable consequence. Amid the chaos, one of the BT-17s in the formation began to falter visibly, its port engine sputtering, smoke curling into the cold air, flames licking the nacelle. The pilot of our bomber felt the aircraft shudder violently as they swooped to cover their faltering comrade, a move that exposed them to even heavier fire. Flak exploded on both sides, showering the plane in sparks and fragments. The gunners leaned into their guns, firing with desperate precision, each shot a prayer aimed at a sky that seemed to conspire against them. The smell of burning metal intensified, mixing with the sharp tang of fear that hung in the cabin like a living thing. Crew members shouted over the roar, voices hoarse, fingers numbed, faces streaked with sweat and grime, but every command, every action was executed with an uncanny precision born of training and terror. For a brief moment, the world outside the fuselage seemed to pause, the only sounds those of the plane straining against the cold, violent air, the gunfire, and the distant, echoing explosions of flak. Then reality snapped back with renewed intensity. Another fighter dove from above, slicing through the tracer fire, its guns spitting death toward the bomber. The pilot twisted the controls, banking and rolling, the plane shuddering violently, metal groaning in protest. In the waist, men adjusted their positions, bracing against sudden jerks, eyes scanning the horizon, hands moving instinctively over ammo belts. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath was both a relief and a risk. As the maneuver continued, pushing the plane to the limits of its design, something remarkable happened. The enemy fighters, momentarily confused and frustrated by the unexpected, audacious movements, began to break formation, allowing a fleeting window of relative calm. The crew's coordinated efforts, precise timing, and willingness to gamble everything bought them precious moments of survival, a temporary reprieve from the storm of steel and fire around them. Yet even in that fleeting calm, the tension never left. The knowledge that disaster could return with a single misstep kept every nerve taut. Amid this maelstrom of smoke, noise, and adrenaline, the human element shone brightest. Each man inside the fuselage understood the fragility of their situation and the necessity of absolute trust in one another. Eyes met across the cabin, a silent communication of resolve and hope. Hands moved without thought, performing actions drilled into muscle memory over countless hours of training. The tail gunner's jaw clenched as he pivoted yet again to meet a diving attacker. The bombardier's eyes narrowed in calculated determination. The pilot's hands white, knuckled on the yoke, guiding the metal leviathan with precision through a sky filled with death. For the first time, the audacity of the maneuver began to reveal its brilliance. The B-17, battered and scarred, twisted and banked in defiance of both gravity and enemy aggression, creating a moving target that the fighters struggled to track. The flak bursts exploded harmlessly around the plane, their violent eruptions merely shaking loose shards of ice and smoke. Inside, the crew exhaled as they could, tension momentarily giving way to focus, and the pilot realized that their gamble might just carry them another few miles closer to safety. The battle raged on unrelenting, but the pattern had shifted. The risky maneuver had bought the bomber and her crew a critical advantage, a chance to survive where statistics suggested none should exist. Every heartbeat, every shudder of the fuselage, every scream of the engines was a reminder of the razor-thin line between life and oblivion, and yet, inch by inch, the B-17 clawed its way forward. The world outside the fuselage was chaos incarnate. Smoke, fire, tracer lines, and distant explosions. But inside, human determination, courage, and the audacity to defy odds created a fragile island of order amidst the storm. The sky over Europe had transformed into a crucible of smoke, fire, and desperate survival, and now, as the final stage of their flight unfolded, the B-17 and her crew found themselves at the razor's edge, where resolve, instinct, and sheer force of will collided with the brutal reality of war. The bomber groaned under the relentless strain, metal warped from concussive blasts, control cables frayed, and engines coughing with each mile, as if the very machine were fighting alongside its crew to stay alive. Inside, the men had passed far beyond exhaustion. Their bodies trembled from tension and cold, their lungs burned from the thin, freezing air, and yet every heartbeat pulsed with a single truth. This was their final chance. The maneuver that had saved them once was nearly complete, but the sky had one more test prepared for them. A gauntlet of flak and flighters that stood between them and the fragile hope of home. The return journey was supposed to be a retreat towards safety, a slow descent back into the arms of friendly territory, but fate had carved a harsher path. Enemy fighters regrouped like shadows gathering at the edge of vision, their silhouettes emerging from the smoky haze with sinister precision. The bomber's damaged port engine sputtered again, trailing a thin line of black smoke that stretched behind them like a grim signature in the sky. The pilot adjusted the throttle carefully, trying to coax more power from the failing engine without pushing it beyond its limits. His gloved hands, stiff from cold and tension, trembled as he gripped the controls, feeling every vibration of the wounded aircraft through the metal frame. The crew braced for another attack, their eyes burning from fatigue, but scanning the sky with renewed determination. The tail gunner, numb from hours in the freezing turret, spotted a formation of enemy fighters diving from above. He shouted into the intercom, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, coming fast!" The warning crackled through the cabin, electrifying the men with urgency. In the top turret, the engineer swung his guns upward, tracking the incoming fighters with trembling precision. Tracers asked into the sky, streaks of light piercing the grey clouds as the adrenaline-fueled gunners poured fire into the approaching threat. The fighters descended with terrifying speed, their engines roaring like predators in pursuit of wounded prey. Their guns flashed bright bursts of muzzle fire, the bullets ripping past the bomber with lethal intention. The bombardier, crouched near the nose, ducked instinctively as rounds peppered the fuselage, sparks showering across the cabin like a shower of angry stars. The sound was deafening, metal tearing, glass cracking, the engines screaming in violent protest, as the bomber shuddered under the assault. One of the waist gunners returned fire, the recoil slamming into his shoulder with a brutal force, each burst of gunfire sending vibrations through his entire body. The pilot pulled hard on the yoke, forcing the plane into a shallow dive, despite the wounded engine's groaning protest. The altimeter needle dropped rapidly, the cold wind slicing through the bullet holes in the fuselage and filling the cabin with a bone, deep chill that felt almost sentient. The men clung to their positions as gravity yanked them downward, the sudden change in altitude making their stomachs lurch. Outside, the winter landscape grew closer, patchwork fields, frozen rivers, and forests smeared beneath the smoky veil of battle. The pilot leveled the plane just above flak range, skimming the edge of danger with impossible precision. It was a gamble, a last desperate effort to break free from the fighters before the plane tore itself apart from structural strain. The enemy pilots corrected their descent, determined to finish the kill. One fighter drew dangerously close to the tail, its propeller spinning like a saw blade inches from lining up the perfect shot. The tail gunner fired relentlessly, each burst of gunfire rattling the turret, his breath fogging the cracked glass as he fought through numbness and pain. The tracers found their mark. Sparks and smoke erupted from the wing of the pursuing fighter. For a moment, the enemy aircraft wavered, tipping sideways before erupting into a plume of fire. The tail gunner watched as the flaming wreckage spiraled toward the ground, but there was no relief in his eyes, only the grim understanding that more enemies were closing in. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's forehead was beaded with sweat, despite the freezing temperature, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. The co-pilot shouted readings from failing instruments, many of which flickered erratically or had gone completely dead. The navigational systems, rattled by the earlier flak bursts, displayed ghost readings that conflicted with visual landmarks. The pilot had no choice but to trust his instincts and the fading horizon, guiding the bomber by sheer intuition. The engines sputtered again, the starboard side vibrating with a grinding metallic wail that signaled impending failure. Yet the pilot held steady, fighting every second to keep the bomber airborne. Then came the moment they all knew would decide their fate. Ahead, stretching across the horizon like a barrier of fire, lay one final band of heavy flak, a wall of bursting black clouds, each explosion a violent blossom of shrapnel and sulfur. The crew stared through the frost-covered glass, their hearts pounding as they recognized the unmistakable signature of a fortified enemy line. They were too low to avoid it and too damaged to climb. There was no turning back. The pilot glanced at his crew, a brief, silent exchange of resolve passing between men bound not by orders, but by shared sacrifice. "Hold on," he said quietly into the intercom, voice steady despite the chaos. "We're going through." The bomber entered the flak field like a battered ship sailing into a hurricane. Explosions detonated around them, shockwaves slamming into the fuselage with brutal force. Metal panels tore loose, spinning into the wind like deadly shrapnel. One blast rocked the plane so violently that the waist gunners were thrown against the bulkheads, their helmets cracking against steel, oxygen masks ripped from faces, the hoses whipping like serpents in the turbulence. The interior lights flickered wildly, casting stuttering shadows over the strained faces of the men who clung to their stations. Through the chaos, the pilot held the plane steady, every muscle in his arms burning, jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. The yoke vibrated violently in his hands, as though the plane were trying to wrench itself free from his grip. The co-pilot shouted altitude readings, each one dropping closer to disaster. The flight engineer screamed warnings about overheating engines, oil pressure collapsing, and structural integrity failing. The bomber's wings flexed under the assault, bending dangerously, the groans of stressed metal echoing like a wounded beast. A direct hit rocked the cabin, sending sparks flying through the nose section and tearing open a jagged hole in the fuselage. The freezing air blasted through with ferocious intensity, knocking the bombardier backward and extinguishing any trace of warmth. But even as the bomber threatened to come apart mid-air, the crew refused to give in. They tightened their harnesses, braced their bodies against the unforgiving jolts, and shouted critical information through the static-filled intercom. The plane was dying, piece by piece, but its crew fought to keep it alive. Then, as suddenly as it began, the flak field thinned. The bursts became sporadic, then distant, then silent. The bomber emerged from the cloud of destruction, torn, smoking, limping through the sky like a wounded ghost, but miraculously still airborne. The men inside stared ahead in stunned disbelief, their breath shallow, their bodies trembling with an adrenaline crash so intense it felt physical. They had survived the gauntlet. They had survived the impossible. But the battle wasn't finished. Now came the final test, getting the dying aircraft safely to the nearest friendly airfield. The pilot scanned the horizon, eyes searching for any sign of Allied markers. The co-pilot keyed the fading radio, calling out distress signals through static and interference. They were deep over hostile territory, engines failing, altitude dropping, fuel lines compromised. Every mile felt like a journey through a collapsing world. At last, after what felt like an eternity trapped between sky and death, they saw it. The faint outline of an Allied emergency strip carved into a clearing below. A runway too short, too rough, too uncertain for a fully functioning bomber, let alone one held together by little more than faith and rivets. But it was their only chance. The pilot began his descent, the landing gear groaning as it lowered unevenly, one wheel jammed, the other shaking violently. The bomber dipped dangerously, the nose dropping before the pilot corrected, guiding the plane with the precision of a surgeon and the faith of a man who had no option left but success. The landing was violent. The wheel struck the ground with a bone-shattering impact, the fuselage screeching as metal scraped against earth. The bomber skidded, bounced, then lurched sideways, tearing across the rough field in a cascade of dirt and snow before finally grinding to an agonizing halt. Silence followed, a heavy, overwhelming silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of the men inside. They had done it. They had survived the sky's fury, the enemy's precision, and their aircraft's mortal wounds. And in that frozen moment, the crew understood the truth. The risky maneuver that no one believed could save them had done exactly that.